Now, Hamas, in exchange for that, has been demanding the entry of more fuel into the Gaza Strip. The United Nations and other international aid agencies are warning that fuel for hospitals and essential institutions is set to run out completely in the coming days. Israel, however, remains steadfast in its refusal to allow power-generating materials to enter the enclave, as it will likely be confiscated by Hamas. Yet, once again, Israel tries to dispel the claim of the lack of energy supplies. On Friday, the IDF released a recording of a call between an IDF officer and a senior official in the energy industry in the Gaza Strip. Take a listen.
مشكلة كمان السولار والمحروقات.
لسه في
وين في؟ انا بقول لي فيش؟ انا بحكي مع اسم المستشفى بقول لي فيش؟
ايش برا المستشفيات يعني؟
لا
في بنزين، هي البنزين مع واسطة بروح على المحطة بروح في بنزين
يعني الجماعة ماسكة كل الامور المحروقات؟
حتى غاز اللي هو وسط بروح بعد من غاز وبطلع، اللي انتم وسط بعد البنزين وبطلع.
حتى في المستشفيات يعني؟
لا في المستشفيات هم اللي ودوا لها السولار، هم المسؤولين عن المستشفيات، يعني بالنهاية هم اللي ودوا السولار لانه في سولار.
مين حماس؟
عندهم سولار المحطات. عنده سولار فيه، عنده اقل شيء مليون لتر. انا بقول لك اليوم يعني اليوم مثلا بتحكي اليوم الخميس، اعتقد من ممكن الخميس الجاي يكون فاش كله منشأ. هلا المحطات ملاني وفي بياخذوا منها بودوا السولار للمستشفيات، يعني بيسحبوا منها عن طريق الشحن بودوا للمستشفيات، ولسه ولا هم اسمع لحتى بيحكموا في البلد صراحه.
شو اسمه؟ انفاق
كل شيء لسه ما تبهدلوا يعني صراحه، لسه ما هم ماسكين كل شيء صراحه يعني. وفي تحت في الارض انا متاكد في نص مليون اقل شيء، في نص مليون لتر. بالنهايه انت عارف الانفاق بدها اكسجين وبدها تليفونات وبدها ميه وبدها حمامات وبدها عماره. في
نص مليون لتر تحت الارض
اقل شيء. سيء. اما لو الشعب كله مات كل يوم اسرائيل قتلت 10,000 شخص مواطن ما بتأثر بمهمش ولا عبالهم، المهم هم يبوهم.
Fuel for families. Excuse the bad alliteration there, but that's what it comes down to, Owen. We're talking about the exchange of fuel for civilians, not military officials, families.
Yes, and obviously the hostages need to be freed, and holding hostages is a war crime. As for the fuel, look, the situation depends on the facts, right? If the Israeli military is correct, that there's plenty of fuel in Gaza, and Grisha has made this point over and over again in our studio, then it's not Israel's responsibility to let more fuel into Gaza. There's enough fuel there to provide essential services, which is what's needed. Of course, hospitals and trucks to be able to distribute essentials of life. And the military says there's enough fuel. If for whatever reason that's not true, then there needs to be fuel allowed in so that hospitals can run and trucks can deliver food and water to 2 million civilians. Listen, I've said since the beginning of the war that a policy on Israel's part that does not allow water, food, medicine, and I would add fuel for essential services such as those that I laid out is a policy that is not going to be realistic over the long term, putting aside ethical issues and legal issues, which are confusing, particularly in this case of fuel, because of the facts, right? If there's enough fact, then Israel doesn't have a legal or even ethical obligation. But as a matter of foreign policy, it's going to be difficult to sustain this. And we saw this with the water and the food, and we may see this with the fuel, although I have to say I am surprised that there hasn't been more of a reaction over the last 48 hours or so to the Israeli decision not to allow fuel in. Maybe that's because Israel has convinced its partners and allies with its intelligence that it doesn't need to provide fuel because the fuel is already there.
Grisha, you are itching to comment.
Yes, I have to. I think I said it here over and over again, as Owen said. We see videos from Gaza, ambulances evacuating wounded people, okay? Horrible sights in Gaza. But then whenever they enter to a hospital, there's light. And just an evening before that, everybody said in 24 hours there will be no fuel to the hospital. Now, what do you think the reason that Daniel Hagari showed Shifa Hospital? As long as there will be fuel and the hospitals will be with light, it means the headquarters underneath them will have ability to continue functioning. So we will see that all the hospitals at the Gaza Strip, like the Indonesian hospital, Shifa Hospital, El Quds Hospital, and others, and Nasser in Khan Yunis, okay, all Hamas headquarters are underneath those hospitals. This is why the hospitals will continue functioning, because the generators that operate the hospital are actually the generators that provide life to the people on the ground. And it's Hamas, the cowards. As simple as it is.
So one can't function without the other, and because Hamas needs it for its military operations, whether Hamas cares or not,
De facto, the
hospital is going to have power. And if that's the case, and if there's enough fuel for trucks to bring food, and one would imagine, I don't know, they could fill up in Rafah and on the Egyptian side of the border. I don't know.
I want to be clear.
But again, there needs to be enough fuel to provide essential services. And if the fuel, for whatever reason, is not in Gaza, Israel needs to allow it. I think that's the bottom line.
I want to be clear about this also, okay? Hamas smuggled for years, okay, with pipes from Egypt underground during the Muslim Brotherhood regime in Egypt, before that with Mubarak, and after that with the Sisi, okay? Millions on millions of liters, okay, that they bought cheap fuel in Egypt because it's way cheaper. It means 2.5 shekels. And in Israel, it's 6.5, 7 shekels, okay? So with the money that you collect for the electricity that people consume in Gaza, that Hamas are supposed to deliver the money to the PS treasury, with the money, they bought the smuggled diesel and sold it to the people in Gaza at the same price that it's the cost in Israel. But actually, they stored millions on millions of liters underground. It's well known, and I've said it here from the first day.
In preparation.
Of course.
And I will say this, the fact that Israel hasn't been under more pressure internationally, particularly from governments, I'm not talking about the media, I'm talking about friendly governments, right? Over the course of the past 48 hours on the fuel issue, since the latest announcement from the military, I think a day or two ago about this, I think implicit in that, we can read into that maybe those governments are convinced by the kinds of arguments that Grisha is making here.
Well,
right?
let me challenge you either way, because you mentioned that it might be a mistake on Israel's part in the long term if they don't allow this fuel in. But then again, people seem to forget that there's two crossings into Gaza. There's Rafah from Egypt, and obviously there's the crossings from Israel. So Israel perhaps maybe not bombing the Rafah crossing to not allow that in, but surely then Egypt, who defends the Palestinians so wholeheartedly, should also have some responsibility at getting the fuel in there, and not Israel?
Well, wait a second. I mean, obviously, look, Israel's not paying for fuel for Gaza, or food or water, to say the least. And our crossings are completely closed. And I think the understanding is they're going to remain closed after the war. So if it were true that, for example, under the U.S. visa scheme, that American citizens living in Gaza could cross the border and fly out of Ben Gurion Airport, maybe a question mark whether that will happen. Again, I'm speculating, I admit. But the state of play was Israel was not allowing some of these trucks to cross from Egypt into Gaza. And that was the hang-up. For reasons that can be understood, Israel doesn't want weapons to come through with them and so forth. It needs to be regulated. All I'm saying is a situation on the ground where 2 million people who are civilians, of course I'm not talking about the Hamas fighters, civilians aren't able to get the basics of life, is a situation that, among other things, is bad in the big picture for Israel. Again, this is the point the Biden administration has made, and not only them. And I'm not talking about sending flowers into Gaza. You know, by the way, there's a very misleading statistic out there that only 2% of the usual trucks are coming into Gaza. Of course, because general commercial goods aren't going to be coming into Gaza right now, and there's no obligation, presumably under Israel, to allow them in. So it's a false. The question is, how much essential goods does Gaza need, right? And what percentage of that is getting in? But if there is enough fuel in Gaza for these basic needs, and if governments abroad are convinced of that, then I think it's fine not to allow it in. It's a factual question, but I think everybody needs to understand that a situation where people in Gaza are without the very basics of life is a situation that's obviously bad for those civilians, but I think also by extension bad for Israel.
Well, then, Grisha, who do we get that information from? Because if we can't trust what Hamas is saying in terms of the essential needs that are lacking, and we can't trust the United Nations because they're following Hamas's lead in terms of the information, then how do we actually know exactly what essential needs are needed in the Gaza Strip by the civilians?
And that's a great question.
I want to be clear about it. We also cannot trust UNRWA, because UNRWA official declarations were that hospitals are about to stop functioning because we don't have fuel. And again, it went out that they are lying. So who is saying the truth? I agree with you. People as you've heard, the guy from, the IDF officer that spoke to the one inside Gaza, this is how we did it in the past. We knew what is the storage at warehouses in Gaza when we spoke to people. So you need to understand that also the IDF was prepared for not for such a horrible event, but for a possible war with Gaza. So you have names, you have phones, you know how to talk to people, to talk. By the way, the only organization that will always say the truth will be the ICRC. So we also can be dependent on them. I would just want to add one thing. The obstacle about fuel is UNRWA, because UNRWA were the only ones who brought the fuel from Israel. And now we will have to force them to get it from Egypt, if at all, and that will create another issue. And in Gaza, everything is dependent on energy. The wells, the hospitals, the generators, everything is dependent on that. And Hamas will push the humanitarian card till the end, and they will try and show the world that there is a crisis in Gaza, and I hope that they will fail.
Reserve Colonel Grisha, Yakubovitch, Owen, Alterman, thank you, gentlemen, very much for breaking all that down and for the analysis in studio. Stay with us.